Welcome to the live Q&A sessions with Aarti. And we are with Tian Chainan, who will be moderating this Q&A questions. So first of all, thanks to Aarti for this really thoughtful presentations. It's really thought-provoking, and it's like taking me back to when I was sitting in the organization management class or psychology class, but that's, I think, even though it's can be philosophical, but it's very practical in our day-to-day working environment now. So artists, we have a number of questions sent in by the attendees. So I would suggest that we tackle them one by one. How do you feel with that?
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
Okay.
I think you have the list, right?
Yes, I have the list.
Okay,
So
great.
I will be reading the question to you. Right?
Okay.
The first question was asked by Jagdish Adhikari. The question is, what should be the new strategies and roles during and after COVID-19 for the NGOs and networks who are working in anti-human trafficking sector?
Yeah. So I think there were quite a few questions around COVID and the pandemic. Firstly, what I wanted to really raise is that within our organizations, we are going to be bound to be feeling and experiencing similar dynamics of anxiety and other aspects that are taking place in the communities that we serve. So, you know, if our communities are afraid of, you know, their health and their well-being in terms of their health, this may be mirrored within, you know, within our organizations. The other aspect of COVID and the pandemic is, you know, the economic survival that people are really incredibly worried about and are suffering, you know, around. This again is affecting our organizations. I already know so many NGOs that have had their funding cut. So on some sides, you know, the needs are increasing, but the resources are decreasing. So there's this feeling of overwhelm. So the question is, it's not just about serving, it's not just about serving our beneficiaries in the best way that we can. It's also about being able to manage the tensions, the anxieties within the organization. So it's about understanding the projects and the activities we want to do out there, especially given that migrant workers and communities are even more vulnerable now, more vulnerable to exploitation and trafficking. Children aren't in school, so they're more at risk of child labor. At the same time, we need to make sure that our organizational structures and boundaries are very clear, well communicated, that our staff is well taken care of. You know, it's not just about, you know, giving money, but everybody is given, you know, incredible like patience. There's clear boundaries around procedures in the organization, leave, you know, things like this. I know organizations, NGOs based in Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, they've cut staff funding, they've cut staff salaries because of the funding issue. So what are the other ways in which staff are being, you know, taken care of so that they can do their jobs as best they can? So these are some of the things that I think are really important to consider in organizational resilience. It's not just about what we design as projects and programs out there. It's about how we also turn the lens around and make sure that our own structures and boundaries are really clear, particularly when people are working from home and things like that. So yeah, I think there's something that came on up in the chat box. Yeah.
Yes. So I think this is like indeed it's a really challenging time for all of us, that we are facing with internal factors, external factors that impacted on our work. Maybe the next question by Gigi Tubas. I mean, ask maybe you to go deeper, to dig deeper into this. She asked that she would love to learn important principles, action, decisions in leading your organization to be resilient during this pandemic crisis. This is more ray of hope or more dark cloud?
It's really interesting because a lot of people have been talking about the darkness right now in the world, but then the same people are also talking about the light. And from a philosophical perspective, we do need almost some darkness and some light, so that we know what light is. If we didn't have darkness, we wouldn't know what light is. If we didn't have light, we wouldn't know what darkness is. And the resilience is built through facing challenges. So some of the, I've already given some of the points around practices, but it's about being honest and having that reflective space. The main, if I was to say one thing that you could bring into your organization is having that reflective space regularly, where you listen to each other about how they're feeling, but not see it only as their personal feeling, but listen to it. If you're a manager, listen to the feelings as if the organization itself is talking to you, and therefore you can respond to the organization as a system. And also taking that as a message from the communities that you also are serving. So it's about opening reflective spaces at work.
Yeah, I agree with that. Question from Andy Ericers, is related to the strategies that we can use, that we should have now, because what are some of the effective strategies of the NGO in the human trafficking sector to be resilient in the face of disasters such as pandemic that affected every one of us? So I think you already mentioned about the principle and action, but maybe in terms of for the organization to formulate strategies, how would you suggest them to do that?
Right. So, in the face of disaster, I think that question is.
Yeah.
In the face of disaster, obviously, if an event has taken place, then of course, action needs to be taken fast. Focal points need to be agreed on, and clear decision makers need to be identified. So when we're responding to disasters, there's less time. It seems like there's less time for reflection, but clear decision makers, people with the authority to make the decisions, and clear roles that are to follow, clear timeframes in place. So those are really important strategies. They don't work in the long term. A disaster response strategy is a short-term strategy. They're not for the long term. Over the long term, it's something different. What I would also suggest is that whenever your staff are going out and working in disaster zones or things like this, it's really important to ensure that when they come back to the office, when they come back from doing the field work, that there is an opportunity for them to do debriefing. Debriefing is where you check in with your staff, you check in with your team, you ask them, how are they? How did it go? Even if it's just 20 minutes on the call, you can do it as a group, you can do it one-on-one. As managers, I would also encourage you to have regular role debriefings with your staff once a month, something like this, where you listen to how they're experiencing their role. You ask them how they are feeling in their role and what you think, about how they're taking up their role. Because the way somebody navigates their role is about understanding their inner idea of what their job is, as well as what the other people think their job is. So those are just a couple of things.
Great. I think among the audience, they would like to go further by asking questions.
There's some chat. Yeah, there's some here.
Alan Valdez and the other persons asking about the best practices in the organization, that maybe if you could give some example of what are the best practices that they could look up at right now in these situations.
So those are some of the best practices, with the debriefing, role debriefing. Another is to look at dynamics that are happening that are really troublesome, such as you may have a team and one person in that team is holding a particular weight They may be being scapegoated. They may be being blamed. They may be turning up late. It might seem like they are the problem, but sometimes they may be holding the problem on behalf of the rest of the team. It's not just that one person may be feeling that way. Yeah, it's a short time for me to give lots of examples, but I can take this example here from Claire Bartram, who says, I'd be interested in how to build resilience with all volunteer teams that work remotely. So with volunteer teams, it's really important to be clear about their roles and be clear about their tasks and the time that they should be spending on that work. One of the things that volunteers have in abundance is a lot of drive and a lot of enthusiasm. But at the same time, they may not have a lot of experience. So what's really important is to limit tasks to what's been said. Try not to, ask volunteers to work over the times and the tasks that are set for them. Also support their learning over time, and keep in clear communication with them. Try to stick to working hours. Try to stick to work-based communication platforms, such as emails. If you have Slack, I would keep to Slack. They can have your personal phone number if they have an emergency, but I wouldn't give my phone number. For example, for me, I know that I can't give my phone number to everyone. I prefer, for example, not to be contacted for work on the weekend, unless it's important. I've been working in anti-trafficking for, over 18 years. This work could go on ad infinitum. But if I'm not standing, there will be no one to do this work in my role, right? Yeah. So it's really important to practice good boundaries. Good boundaries in all settings. Boundaries are not walls. Boundaries are negotiable. So with your volunteer team, if they're remotely, they do need to have, you need to have clear, regular calls with them, but they should be within work hours. I mean, obviously time zones, and everything should be on the table. There shouldn't be any other kind of, there can be other informal conversations that are going on, but nothing secret. Everything should be put on the table as a team. And I'm talking about team resilience here. So these are just some of the, yeah.
Yes, I think that's especially important as we are now in the COVID-19 and many organizations have work from home policy. So everybody is like working from home, and then how do we create the boundary as you suggest, because our work can be daunting, it can consume us. So I think these are very, very useful tips and advice. As you already mentioned about the volunteers, so maybe this question from Emma Brewster that came in, which is related to the volunteers, on how do you see different ways of growing and developing resilience among volunteers for those who have a full-time job as opposed to staff who are full-time in the NGO? So those volunteers who may already have their full-time job, but they want to help the NGOs, so they come to work. So how do you see that you can help them with the resilience among these volunteers?
So I would be interested to know what kind of volunteers people are talking about. In some situations, you shouldn't take volunteers. That's a clear, no. For example, if you have a shelter and you have children, vulnerable children or vulnerable adults working in the shelter, I would say the volunteers, the only situations where you might have a volunteer is if they're coming with some experience, specialist experience. But generally, I would be very wary of just kind of taking on unskilled volunteers. When we're talking about volunteers, there's so many different types of volunteers. Sometimes volunteers can have an abundance of good intentions, but they don't really understand the contexts. For example, in Asia, we have a big problem with voluntourism. You know about voluntourism, right?
Yeah.
So
yes.
people are paying People are paying so that they can come to Asia, they can come to Africa, and so-called teach children. This isn't really helpful for the children. In
like
my view.
volunteer.
Yeah, exactly.
Quite like
Volunteerism.
volunteer.
Yes, it's a volunteer, isn't it? And what you're
Yeah.
doing is you're selling an experience. So I guess it's just a little bit difficult for me to know what kind of volunteers you are talking about. What
But I
else
think
did I want to say about?
a good point about, I mean, having like volunteers who might be dealing with something that's really sensitive issues, like working with children and etc.
Yes,
I think they have to be more
absolutely
careful
not.
with that. But maybe if they were working on, like, I don't know, maybe the tech support, the IT or something, maybe that is something that maybe less sensitive.
Well, it depends, right? So if they're coming for 1 month, what can a volunteer do in 1 month?
Yeah.
If you're employing a volunteer for 1 year, I would question why you're employing a volunteer for a whole year. Why are we not being able to pay our volunteers? Maybe it's a different kind of volunteer program where some payment or some allowance is being given, and there is a mutual exchange of learning. So when there's a volunteer, understand what the exchange is. Why is this person volunteering with you? Are they volunteering with you because they want to learn, they want to have some experience? Well, then make sure that you also giving that back. But it has to be an exchange.
Right.
We have some questions here in the chat box.
So,
should we?
Yeah,
There's
let's go through that.
on,
Yeah, so there are more questions. How do we make our work-life balance in the time of COVID? How much we trust them to work from home? I think this is
very good question. So first of all, it's really important to have a clear work-life balance. And it's harder when you're working from home during COVID because you're in your territorial boundaries are being brought into one space. So if you're working from home or if you have staff working from home, they should work in a separate room. They should work with their door closed. You can see my door is closed. You should have clear deliverables for your team. They may not be able to work the same 9 to 5 hours, but they may be able to, change, for example, if they've got children. You have to be able to trust your staff. Have regular check-ins. So have like a daily 20-minute check-in with the team. Everybody comes together. Everybody's focused on what their work is for the day. You can have at the end of the day, everybody reports on what they've been doing or everybody reports on what they will be doing. The other thing, I think that question's from Vijay. So Vijay, one of the things that I use, my team is based in, 10 different countries. I use an online platform called Slack, and I only use this for work. It's only used for work. And so I have the team, and we are constantly like talking as if we might be in the office together. Hey, Matthew, did you send me that email? And Vijay, can you just have a look at this document for me? And sometimes if people have to go offline for a couple of hours, they go because, the shops are going to close early. They have to go now. And I'm very flexible. What I find is the more I trust my team to work and deliver things on time, the more they, more than compensate. And trust is a given. You have to have a reason not to trust.
Start with trust and then giving like you mentioned, having the objective results that you can measure and then check in with them on a regular basis, right?
Yes, like if they're delivering, then,
If the result is fine, then should be okay in that sense. Yes. So I think there's some clarification from Karina Osby. I mean, she earlier asked question that you already answered, but she gave more information related to the volunteer work.
Right. That's helpful.
The volunteer project I'm talking about is local people helping their own neighbors, especially during COVID crisis. creating support groups. Most of these poor people don't have a separate room.
Yeah.
And when you
Yeah.
ask about the context.
So this is a wonderful, sounds like a wonderful project. I think what I'm feeling very touched by is the fact that this is like your, volunteers within a community helping their own neighbors. I think that's wonderful. So I feel very touched by that, because in my head I had, international volunteers or whatever, and so in that subject, in this kind of project, what's coming up for me is self-care. Self-care is really important to support, and how can they practice boundaries? So in this situation, when the people they're helping is right next door, how do they take care of themselves as well? Even to things like, are they eating properly? Are they sleeping properly? And when you're in your community and you're helping people in your community, you may also experience some of the feelings that are not theirs. They are the people that they're helping. So when you debrief with such volunteers, be a space for them to explore their experiences, but also help them separate what doesn't belong to them personally and what is coming to them through their role. Sometimes we can become very afraid when we're experiencing something like feelings, and we think they're our own feelings, but they're not always. So if you ask a little bit about, what is the story of their neighbors, you may see some parallels. So just listen, asking the right kinds of questions. Also, when you debrief with your volunteers in this setting, you also need to be clear on your boundaries. So if you have a debriefing call with them and it's for 1 hour, try to stick to the 1 hour, because if you allow your boundaries and not to contain them, they need to be contained and held. If you start becoming too flexible with those boundaries, then they are also not feeling held enough. So that's really important. And be aware of any parallel processes on you. So these are some thoughts.
Yes. So I see that there are questions and comments coming in, but I think given the time constraint that we have, I would like to pick this one from Matthew Fairfax. He said that he loved the presentations. He said, I think that it is very challenging for organization to look at when it is truly systematic and when it is a true employee issues. Can you speak to how to determine the difference? I think it came from your presentations.
Yeah, it can be hard. There's some indicators. So one indicator is where the role itself is, there's actually a paper. If you want to write, if anybody wants to write to me, you can. And Matthew, I can send you a paper. It's called, it's called something like, Is the Poison in the Bottle? And that's to do with the role. Sometimes you can recruit different people for the same role and they keep having the same issue. In which case, the indicator is showing that there's the issue with that role, and the way that it's being held by the organization and the function that it's supposed to have. The other part of it is, for example, how does everybody else, that person, that employee, when they were recruited for that role, who recruited them? Why were they recruited? Was the issue with that employee not understood before they were recruited? Those can be looked at as a way of understanding whether it's the employee or whether it's the team. Sometimes people will blame another when they're actually half or partly responsible themselves. So, in the moment, I have to give an example. When someone keeps coming in late for a meeting, right? So let's say the victim rights person keeps coming in late for the meeting, and you can say, you know what, that person, she keeps coming late. She doesn't care about our team meeting. She keeps turning up late. What if the team reflected on what it is about the victim's rights officer role that is difficult to have in the room? unconsciously? Is it because it's hard to see the problems that victims have? Is it because it's hard to support survivors of, let's say, trafficking? Is there anything that's mirroring this dynamic from the context? And sometimes you explore a pattern without making it personal. If you explore that for a while, Matthew, and the problem persists, then it's something else.
Yeah, I think also maybe on the topic of how we draw a line between volunteer and full-time employees. How I think that's also quite a tricky situation as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there are a number of issues that you already stimulate the thinkings and the thought process into this. But I mean, as we have a limited time, I hope that we can continue the conversation through the application, the Wova app. I mean, there are forums that you can continue the discussions, but I'm also sure that Aarti would also love to continue the discussion through others platform that we can reach her. So with that, I would like to thank a lot to Aarti for
thank you, Kunwirawat.
very thoughtful presentations, and thanks the audience for really lively discussions and questions. So thanks everyone, and see you in the next sessions. Yeah, thanks.
Thank
Aarti.
you. Bye.
Bye.